Typically, animating digitally is done one of two ways, by drawing it or generating it. Now, most are familiar with being able to put together a motion tween and doing generated movement, but the rabbit hole in Toon Boom Harmony goes so ridiculously deep that I'm yet to really meet anyone that knows everything that is truly going on. Good hello to you and welcome to all you need to know about parameters and functions in Toon Boom Harmony. My name's Colin, this is Onion Skin. This is a Toon Boom mega tutorial where everything is together in one massive video, and rather than going through with actually making something from start to finish, it's going to be demonstrating everything that can be done. So I'd like to think of it being more up to your imagination as to how you think these features and techniques will be useful to you and your workflow. Kind of like that saying, catch someone to fish or teach someone to fish. This one's more on the teach someone to fish end. So let's get started. First of all, I would like to point out that animation mode, the picture of the little yellow running man, is for now turned off. So everything you can do with any given layer, whether it be an effect or just a regular drawing, is shown in the layer properties panel. So selecting just this drawing layer here, you can see all of this stuff opens up. Under transformation, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do: position, scale, rotation, skew, and pivot. And you'll notice that each of these have a number represented next to them. Everything that has a number is what's called a parameter. And you can see that position, for example, in fact has 3 parameters. The numbers that can be assigned to any type of parameter is just that. The computer only sees it as a number. What the number does only matters once it's been assigned to a particular parameter type. So for example, you'll notice scale is already on 1, and if I was to change scale X to 2, it has doubled in size because scale works in, times itself. Whereas rotation, on the other hand, works in degrees, where 360 is a complete rotation, 180 is upside down, 45 is that amount, you know what I mean? Every incremental value between 0 and 360 will rotate at varying amounts. Position, however, is a little bit strange. It's not measured in centimeters or pixels, but in fact is 12 units up and 16 units across. Now, anyone coming from a digital background will be quite confused by that, but traditional artists will probably be feeling quite at home. On any frame that has a drawing existing, right-click along the top of the camera view and hit Camera View. This will bring up these controls, and there's this one of a grid. Turning that on, you can see this grid, which is called a field chart. And what's quite confusing to digital artists is that it's 12 units up, 12 units across, but it's not square. 12 this way is not equal to 12 this way. And that's because the shape of each one of these little boxes is the same dimensions as the larger one, or the same dimensions as this section, or in fact, any small group of chart levels. In the traditional days, this was used for positioning camera movements and all sorts of things like that. So getting used to the idea of how a field chart works can help you tremendously in the long run. When punching in numbers for the position, you'll notice that punching in positive or negative numbers will change it to E or W. This of course stands for east and west. On the Y value, it's N and S for north and south, whereas Z, 3D space, is corresponding to F and B for forwards and backwards. Now, as well as inside the layer properties panel, you can also access any layer's parameters from the timeline itself. This little plus button here, crack that open and you can see all of the parameters that we've already become familiar with. Position X, Y, and Z, rotation angle Z, and scale X and Y, and a skew. In the very bottom left of the screen, there is another little button here with, kind of looks like an angle. Open that up and you see it is the parameters section. We can now see the same numbers that we did before, and just dragging them across will do the same thing. Notice that pushing this up to 8.6, for example, is represented up here in layer properties 8.6 east. Now, of course, we're artists. We don't want to be working numerically and with maths. This is just the way that the computer sees and understands everything we're doing. Performing these actions in a visual way is very easy. On the tools panel is the free transform tool. Everything on the layer will be included inside of this box. Make sure again that animation mode is turned off, and that's represented by a red bounding box. Everything inside the drawing will get this sort of tint of purple. Notice as I click and drag it around, you can see inside the layer properties panel that the X and Y position is being updated in real time. As I move it up towards the top of the screen, you'll start to see that Y approaches 12, move it off to the side, it starts to get to 16. So it is reflecting the same numbers that we've seen before. You'll notice also that rotating it around is updating the angle in real time, upside down, -180, before going all the way around 360, and it will continue on going because it's registering multiple rotations. Of course, it's the same for the scale as well. Holding shift will lock it and have both parameters move equally. Now there is another set of transformation tools that I'm personally very fond of. Not many animators I know use them, but personally they are my favorite. Right click along the top of the main toolbar and go to Advanced Animation. That will bring up these tools here. And there are a few subtle differences between the two toolset types. The Free Transform tool does a bit of everything. You know, we were moving, rotating, scaling, all with the one tool. You can box select with it and grab more than one shape at a time, and just whatever piece of artwork you select is whatever is the active one. These tools up here, however, are layer exclusive. So whichever one you currently have selected, if I go to this position one, for example, I can't get to the other ones. However, what's really nice and kind of quick to use about it is it doesn't matter where I click. I can just move anywhere around the screen and things will happen. So I really like this tool because I can just be a lot less careful with it. You know, grab that, move it over there, and there we go. So now it's time to start animating these parameters. And we'll see the fundamental differences between having the animation mode button off as opposed to when it's on. So I've now activated that, and as soon as I grab this compass shape, you'll notice in the layer property section over to the right that the X and Y positions have become grayed out. I'm not going to be able to select those anymore. And when I let go and make my decision, these equations have been put in their place. Drawing position X, 13 west, and drawing position Y, 8.7 north. And I cannot click on these or change them. That's because as far as the computer is concerned, these are no longer just location information. This is animation information. The correct term for it is called a function. You may be more familiar with it being called a motion path or a motion tween. So to explain what I mean, I'm going to go up to frame 50, right click and go to extend exposure. That'll make the artwork visible across 50 frames, and you'll notice the first frame now, this little box has appeared. That's where this positional information has been recorded. If I go to frame 30 and move it down here, you'll notice another one has appeared with a line connecting between the two. And as I scrub between them, keep your eye on the layer properties section. You can see that the drawing position X and drawing position Y numbers are updating as it figures out where it should be in order to travel between those 2 points. So now it seems that we're restricted to only being able to mess with this in a visual way because we can't get to the numbers themselves. But once again, if we open the parameters down on the timeline view, we can get to those numbers and even update them manually from there. That's because in the timeline, these numbers are only representing the actual frame number that we are currently on. Whereas over in layer properties, it is representing the function as a complete unit. The start, the finish, and everything in between is represented right here. So does that make sense why it won't let us access it from that point? It's seeing the entire animation here, whereas we're only seeing a single unit here. Also notice that this animation moves diagonally and is made up of two different parameters, position X and position Y. So guess what happens if I were to delete position X? We're left with just an up and down movement. And of course, if I delete the up and down movement, we're left with just a cross one. Take another look at this expanded view here, where you can see that everything we've animated has keyframes on it, but also at the very top where the drawing exists also has the keyframes on it. That's because this represents the complete set of parameters. So if I were to take the end of position Y and move it to about there, you can now see how this is a representation of these two combined. Also watch it through, you can see it going diagonally and then will only go across as the up and down movement has concluded. So take advantage of this, being able to mess with the individual parameters and maybe adjusting their numbers can allow you to get some really fine-tuned control rather than just moving the actual shape around with your eyes. Even more interestingly is remember what I said at the start about how all of the parameters are simply a number value until they are assigned their parameter type. So check out what happens if I were to copy this function here and paste it into scale X. It blows it all the way out because it's assigning a value of 0.7, which of course is just moving it a little bit to the right, to a scale X, which is now timesing it 8 times bigger. And moving from 8 to -8 over the course of the function is going to make it do that and flip. Pretty cool. And do with that information what you will. From now you can see from inside of what we thought was just one motion tween or one function is in fact a whole bunch of them, and we can do a whole lot of animating from just inside this piece. So going through, make sure you have your timeline controls open. Right click, go to timeline view, these will all appear. And I'd like to point out the add and delete keyframe buttons. Moving through the different parameters, you can see that you can add keyframes this way. It will just record whatever is there at that point. Position X, for example, 8.9, make a keyframe there, and then move it all the way across, and we'll see that now it moves from left to right very slowly before suddenly having all of its movement towards the end as we moved that keyframe across. Throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to be referring to these boxes, what the program calls keyframes, as motion keys. And the layer at the very top, which represents everything, I'm going to refer to as master keys. Notice that if I create a new master key, it actually plants a motion key down on every single parameter going all the way down. Being comfortable with creating motion keys on the inside of the parameters as well as on the master is very important. You'll save yourself a lot of time and a lot of headaches. I'm going to show a couple examples now. Using this compass, I can create a bouncing ball effect pretty easily. I'm going to position it up here to start. And by the end of the animation, it's going to move all the way across the X plane, but I want the up and down to simply bounce. So at frame 10, it'll be on the ground. I'm going to copy that motion key and plant it down every 10 frames like that. Every incremental frame, I'm going to pull it up just a little bit less every time. There you go. Very crude, very crude and not very convincing because we haven't gotten to easing or function curves yet. But consider how utilizing each of these separate parameters can be used. So you may not be getting into the nitty gritty, and say for example you've just kind of got this thing moving all about the screen like so, and maybe on these two keyframes you want it to be really big. Oh, but hang on. Now it's stayed big. I wanted it to be small on these other ones because it's treating all of the parameters and functions as separate elements. So remember, of course, planting down master keys will lock every single parameter inside. So trying that example again, if I put down master keys at the different locations first and then move it all about on each one, I can be rest assured that if I make it really big on just this one frame, it's going to be back down to its regular size when it gets to the next, because planting those master keys has registered keyframes on every single parameter. We've been doing things quite numerically, quite statistically. We know we can move our shapes around visually, but let's now create functions visually. So I'm going to set up master keys, make sure this toolbar is open again, and hit the orange button here of the orange line. So at the beginning, I'm going to pull it across to the left towards the end, out to the right, and you see the chain has now come out. Every one of these little notches representing one frame of location, and these circles on either end, notice that it is grayed out with a red section in the middle. That is red for X-axis. Triads of this circle are green and blue for the Y and Z axis. So on the position Y on frame 20, I'm going to create a new motion key here and another on frame 40. Notice that these ones have only the green section filled in. And on frame 30 now, I'm going to pull it up here and we see that we'll have angular joins from place to place. Now, if I created a master key, for example, and it plants everything all the way down, you'll notice that this keyframe has all three spaces filled in, as all of the positional coordinates are going to be registered on this point. Something very fascinating happens when I pull it around. The keyframe for the one we're on is moving around wherever we want to put it, but the one at the end is only ever moving up and down, whereas this triangle section here is becoming squashed up and spread out. Have a think about why that's happening, because these are only registered to a particular, spatial coordinate. Have a play with this and see what you can come up with and get a bit more used to this idea. But again, as I said before, the safest way to work is to plant master keys down on the collapsed layer and then move everything about from there. Each keyframe has blue, red, and green filled in, and it will always move everything, no matter what. The habit to get into if you want to work this way is to create your motion keys first on a collapsed parameter and then perform your movement. If the movement you've created has placed this spline just somewhere off in space, this tool here comes into play in advanced animation. Click on that and it allows you to move the actual path around without interacting with the artwork itself. And last thing before we move on, watch what happens when we start moving the keyframes around. Its positional value will stay the same, but keep your eye here on this bit of spline, that the amount of notches throughout will become more spaced apart, more bunched together, because the timing is being affected. Likewise, if we open up the parameters and start moving the individual pieces around, the keyframes which had all three sections grouped together are now broken apart as they are existing at different points in time. So try and get used to how this works before diving into it. As you can see, it gets a bit crazy. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how to get a curved motion. You'll notice that all of the paths we've made so far are very angular. Hits an angle, changes direction. And not many people I speak to know that this is a thing. But there are, in fact, two different kinds of motion path. Two different kinds of motion tween, if you will. Back on layer properties for this drawing layer, have a look up in the position section. We've become familiar with the way the X, Y, and Z coordinates work and how it packs it into a group function here, but at the top there are two options. Up until this point, it's been selected as separate. This keeps the X, Y, and Z separate as three individual functions that we can control independently. But this, the 3D path, is its own thing. When it's selected, it will delete everything that's been done so far. So keep that in mind to choose the type of function that you want to use before you start animating. But the difference with the 3D path is that rather than having the X, Y, and Z kept as three functions, it is all grouped together as a single calculation. And what this allows for is curves. Cracking open the parameters panel on the timeline again, you'll notice a distinctive difference that now position is calculated as just one piece. X, Y, and Z all mentioned across one line. But we now have a new one called position velocity, also represented up here. The velocity simply moves between 0.0 and 1.0 from the beginning to the end of the entire movement. These two parts working together is how the program figures out how to curve a path. You'll notice now as well that the keyframes represented along the path do not have the divided sections, but are simply yellow with an X in it for some reason. So both sets of functions of course come with their own pros and cons. So let's have a look at some of the other differences between the two different function types. Popping back over to the separate, you'll notice that the original function that we created is still saved and stored under the separate category, and we can select one or the other. Now going through, if I'm just grabbing and moving it all around, it does seem to behave itself quite well because using the free transform tool is giving it a new X and Y keyframe, see? But if I'm grabbing it by the actual handles and only moving it up or down, then remember it's only registering one of those keyframes. So now moving this one left and right is influencing the motion key that came before it. So keep that in mind. Whereas the 3D path, on the other hand, will always grab all three of the X, Y, and Z no matter what, because remember they're all categorized as one function. Also notice how it's trying to keep things as curved as possible. Sometimes it's a little bit strange, but it can be influenced by opening up the coordinate and control points window. Inside this window, at the bottom section, there's tension, continuity, and bias. Select any 3D path keyframe, and you can start to pull these numbers up and down, moving between 0 and 1. 1 simply representing 100%. So if we were to punch in 0.5, notice that it just got a little bit tighter. So we can also go -1, so negative 100%, and you see it's kind of pushed it out a bit, tried to make it a little bit more round. So on this motion key here, for example, we should be able to see what the three different categories do. Tension will squish the curve up and make it a sharp angle, or try and make it as flat and round as possible. Continuity will pull the curve beyond what the original motion key has, whereas bias simply adds more influence to the left or the right of the curve. Now there is one extra thing that 3D paths are able to do which the separate path cannot. Notice that when a new motion path is created, that the notches along the orange line will become squashed or spread out between the two other points, because the same amount of frames need to be represented either side. You know, the motion key is not moving left or right, only its position is. So moving between here and here still needs to take this amount of time as moving from here to here still needs to take the same amount of time. So sometimes you want to be able to influence the curve or the path of a shape without interacting with its timing. To create one, select the section that has the master keys on it, hover over the spline itself, don't click down, just hover and press P. Sometimes it won't work. To make it work, just move the shape down a little bit, undo that, hover over again, and then hit P. Don't know why it works that way, but it's a pretty easy workaround. A control point looks just like a keyframe, only when I pick up and move this one around, notice what's happening to the notches along the line. They are not moving at all. The shape is being influenced, but the timing is not. This allows us to give an influence to a curve without having to really worry about any kind of animation. These are able to be influenced by the tension, continuity, and bias as well. If you're working with one of these and after a while you do decide that you want its timing to become locked, there is a locked in time option here. Press that, the timing will be locked in place, and it has now become a true motion key, which can be picked up and moved around just like the others. Likewise, the opposite can be done. Here's this motion key down here. If I select that down on the 3D path, you'll notice that locked in time is indeed selected. If I turn that off, the motion key has been deleted, but the actual keyframe still exists. So now I can influence its path, but there is no animation lock on the timeline. Now it's time to talk about easing. Speeding up, slowing down, everything so far has been of an equal pace. I'll switch back to the separate path now. So we've got just a straight angle, every notch along the orange line, equally paced apart. There are so many different ways to create speed up and slow down, also known as easing, or in this particular program, function curves. Many ways to do it, like one-click ways that kind of just do the basic stuff, but you can also get extremely detailed and intricate and spend ages getting things absolutely right. So it depends what you need in the moment. Starting with the easiest way to put in a function curve, select our entire animation, and up here in the top left of the timeline controls is this diagonal line. Click on that and you get a whole bunch of preset curves. Each one of these represents different ways that a piece can speed up and slow down. This one in the middle, for example, it's a bit of an S shape, will speed up and slow down between every movement. Take a closer look at the spline at this point. You'll notice that more notches are bunched towards all of the keyframes, whereas they're more spread out in the middle. If I were to switch it to this sharp curve, for example, you notice now both of these are bunched up at the beginning and spread out at the end. Playing that animation means it's going to speed up across both of those portions. A curve going in the opposite direction, of course, does the opposite. It's going to slow down on each one. So have a play with those, and a lot of the time, that's all you need. But like everything else we've done so far, let's break down and see how the program actually figures this stuff out and how we can use it to our advantage and avoid any nasty little problems that may appear. So the way any function curve works, and it's represented by the shape of these down here as well, is time versus movement. At the beginning of your animation, everything's at 0. At the end of your animation, everything at 100, right? A function curve is when time and movement are treated separately. Okay, so for example, something shaped like this means by this point, a lot of time has passed, but not much movement has. It's less than halfway through its animation, but then suddenly in a very small amount of time, a lot of movement takes place. So basically, a curve like this means the animation will speed up. A lot of common ones are sort of S-shaped like this. And what they do is slow things down at the beginning and the end to give it a very natural movement. The fastest section being in the middle, where there is a lot of movement taking place but very little time. Either end, a lot of time, little movement. Consider now how inside of the parameters of the separate path, you can influence the function curves separately, as they are all separate functions. So at the moment, if again I set the master keys to a ease in, ease out, but say I only want it to ease in and out as it moves up and down, but I want the complete movement from left to right to only speed up and slow down once, so its fastest point is in the middle. Right now, it comes to a halt in the middle. So on position X, I can select its keyframes and change it back to no ease. Now look at what's happened to the curve. Now remember, 3D paths are the only ones that are supposed to be capable of a curved movement, but here is a separate path that is now curved. So consider the reason for this is that the left and right is a complete straight movement, and the up and down is now speeding up and slowing down. The combination of the two creates a curve. Notice that moving left and right, there's no speed up or slow down happening at all, but there is for its up and down movement, which is why it kind of shallows out here at the top and at the bottom. So that's pretty cool that you can break it down to that level. And remember, a 3D path considers the X, Y, Z all as one function, so the function curve can only be applied to the whole thing as a unit. That's what this velocity parameter is. Remember how I said it moves between 0.0 and 1.0? Typically, this number will just rise by an equal amount for every frame. And it's applying an ease to this is what will influence this number here. So notice now at the beginning of the movement where the ease is at its most extreme, this number under the velocity is moving by very small increments. It takes several frames for it to reach 0.1, whereas in the middle, it's skipping quite a lot. Popping back over to the separate once again, I've made a whole lot of duplicates so we can see how to add eases to a whole bunch of different shapes in one go. The easy ease is really handy. See now that if I select it across these bottom three, it has changed the ease of everything we selected. The one in the middle still being the standard movement. But what if something's a bit more complicated than that and it's not available in this drop-down menu here? If we select all of these keyframes here, one of the buttons in the timeline controls is this, Set Ease for Multiple Parameters. Hit that and we get a control box. This is really cool, and this is the way that I personally apply most of my easing. What it does is focuses on a particular motion key at a time, however across a whole lot of layers. So now everything that I have selected, particularly on frame 10, we can get to this handle here, move it around and influence its shape and curve. And this will apply to everything I have selected. This goes beyond just drawing shapes, and you can do it for effects and all sorts of stuff. There's a small guide here, 28 functions selected. So it says 28 even though there's only 4 because it's combining all of the parameters that are inside each one, as we have the master keys selected across all of those. I find this very quick and easy to navigate because you can just punch things in numerically. The bottom row controls how far up and down the handle will be, and the top controls how far across it will be. So often I'll have things set at around 40 on the top, 0 on the bottom. It's a little bit less of an influence than the main preset here, and I find it to be a healthy balance. Try to remember that you need to hit the apply button in order to confirm these changes. Hit apply next, you'll notice it will scoot on over to the next motion key. See, as I go between apply previous and apply next, the timeline has actually jumped ahead to the next motion key there. I'll change both of these to 40, hit apply, and it squishes in a little bit. Apply next, 40, there we go. So I can quickly move through huge chunks of animation and punch in a desired ease. Very handy feature for when you want something a little bit more intricate, but not too complicated to use. Okay, so now we've looked at the easy way to do eases, the medium way to do eases, and now we'll have a look at the most difficult but yet most intricate way to control the function curves. I've set up a new layer now, so there's no function curves existing in the layer properties. Everything is back to just being a single number. Looking over on the right hand side of the layer properties, you'll notice everything that is capable of being animated features one of these blue buttons. If I click on one, notice it's now changed to drawing position x0, meaning that this is now changed from being a number to a function. It's now an animated segment as opposed to just a still piece. If I press on it again, it will now bring up a function window. So even though we're all still in the same program, this is a completely different way to start animating. You can see there's a timeline here, and it's showing a chart similar to the one I showed you before, where left to right is time, and up and down is the amount of movement. When I scrub, I can't move the timeline. I can click to move it around, but I still need to go to the actual timeline in order to be able to pull that left and right. So let's make the same basic movement from left to right with the arc in it, with an up-down movement like we did before. So this time, to make a keyframe, I'm going to frame 10 and pressing this button here. That will add a keyframe in on level 0. I'm going to go up to frame 40, add in another one, and moving its position inside of the function window is by pulling its value like this. I can't move them left and right, only up and down, which changes the value of this particular parameter. So this can feel a bit strange when you could, of course, just move it around visually using the transform controls. But consider for a moment why this exists. You can't interact with this box here. This is how it does so. This sees the function as a unit. The parameters inside the timeline allow us to see the value of the frame that we are currently on, whereas the function editor that we've opened from here allows us to see and edit the function in its entirety. It can be quite an intimidating interface to use for the first time. For one, moving this all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom is making hardly any difference at all. Remember, to get it all the way to the left of the screen, we're going to be looking for around -16 because this is valued by the fill chart. But in order to see all the way to -16, we need to zoom out a lot. In fact, we need to zoom out so far that now time is so spread apart that it's going up to frame 1500. So we can fix this, but first let's set up the movement. So I'll pull the first one down to about -15, the end one up to about +15, and we can press this button here, which will reset the view to the most appropriate layout for the current motion keys that exist. So now our left to right movement is back in place as we're used to it. If I select the free transform tool and press show motion, our spline will reappear so we can see what's happening visually as we edit through the function editor. Remember, this is only seeing the position X at the moment, but it does allow us to see everything that is happening across the position X movement in one go. So we can add in extra keyframes, change its value, and we can pull out function curves from this point, all from within the same window. It even allows us to push beyond 100%. So notice now that the spline has gone past our ending motion key, as the end key is at a value of 15, but the curve itself is going up to approximately 20. So watch what happens. See that? It allows you to make nice little spring motions. And if you're not satisfied with the position of something, it is possible to move a motion key left and right by holding down the option key, and then you can move the motion key like so. Keeping in mind that it is keeping a motion true, so it can't go past the motion keys either side. But because this is a box selector, we can do things like select these two frames either side without selecting the middle one, which wouldn't typically be possible down on the timeline. See on the timeline view how the beginning and end are moving left and right, but the middle is staying put? Pretty cool. From within this window, the Easy Ease also exists. So I can box select everything and go to one of the S shapes, and we get a nice smooth curve. We get a lot more control than we would from using the Set Ease for Multiple Parameters button. Notice at the moment that this handle is influencing just this one curve. But if I were to change it from corner to straight, it will mirror the angle of the handles on either side. However, the length of the handle is not mirrored. But if it is changed again to smooth, it is perfectly mirrored, both the length and the angle. This ensures that any shape you use on the curve will not have a sudden jarring corner to it. Now there is something a bit strange when working between multiple parameters and the regular function editor, especially if you're working numerically. So just keep this in mind, and I think it will mainly just affect how you prefer to work, because they are a bit different, and it's why I personally tend to be in multiple parameters more often than the function editor. And that's because these numbers here will correlate between 0 and 100. So the most extreme ease at 100, the most extreme angle at 100. So both of them at full creates basically something as hectically diagonal as it can get. And if this were at 0, it would be going straight up and down. Does that make sense? 0 and 100 up and down, 0 and 100 across. Whereas this editor works more in tune with what's on stage as opposed to just a percentage. If we're messing with this final curve here, it's up and down rather than 0 to 100 is in degrees. So if you want it to be perfectly flat, you wouldn't have 0, you'd have 180. Whereas the amount it goes across feels very strange when compared to the multiple parameters function. So if we set this one to 50, for example, so it's perfectly halfway between these 2 points, and we'd look over here, and for some reason it's at 6.0032. Now that's because rather than going in correlation to how far it is until the next motion key, it's going in relation to the amount of frames there are in the timeline, okay? So this one here, which is at 25, if this handle were to go out to here, it will be at pretty much, well, let's make it exactly 5 and 180. So frame 20, frame 25, distance of 5 frames, that's how far the handle goes. 10, 15, 20, that's how these numbers work. Something important about this editing window though, which is its con compared to the multiple parameters button, is remember this allows us to edit a whole bunch of functions in one go, whereas this will exclusively only do one. So if this shape were moving all around the show and we opened it up, this is still only controlling the position X value. That may feel somewhat limiting, depends on what you're doing. It's very useful for things like effects. If you're animating a transparency value, it only contains a single function, so you can do all sorts of things with animating a transparency value. We'll have a look at that closer to the end. So remember before when we eased the X and the Y values separately, how it created a curved movement. Let's do it through the function window this time. So I've deleted the motion keys along the position X, just to give us that clean left to right. So on the position Y value, I'm going to press that twice to turn it into an animated parameter and then bring up its window. We want to create motion keys on frame 8 and all the way up on frame 50, and at the halfway point at about 30 there will be another. Now remember, it will take donkey's years to just drag this all the way up because the incremental values are so small, but we know now because of the fill chart that towards the top is approximately a value of 10. So we can punch that in, up it goes. Select all of the motion keys and give that a standard ease in and out. Combined with our X value that is just moving cleanly left to right, we get a nice smooth curve. Now the function editor for a 3D path is very, very different. Switching back over to that, pressing on the create function button for the main path will activate it across the entire array. Press it again, and we get the 3D path editor. You can notice a few differences already. So let's have a closer look at what we got. First of all, it's very zoomed in. Frame 0, frame 6, 0.0, 0.6. So let's create our keyframes this time down on the timeline view. Place one at frame 10 on the master key and one at frame 40. Press the reset view button here and it will zoom us to an approximate view of our entire function. We're going to create the same movement yet again. First doing the X value. Notice here that there's a button that will scroll us between the X, Y, and Z values. So remembering the values of the field chart, the first frame we want to have at about -10. And this one at +10. Now it will move left to right. Switching to the Y value, you'll notice that keyframes already exist. Because remember, 3D paths count X, Y, and Z all as one function. So selecting frame 25 and adding one in, and we're going to pull its value up to about +10, you'll notice it's already created the curve. Popping back over to the X, we can see that it's got a very subtle curve applied there already. And if we move it up and down, we can see how that is changed. Up in the top section, rather than having function curve controls, we have the tension, continuity, and bias controls that we've seen before. And like those, if we change those between 1 and -1, the sharpness of the curves will be influenced. So now you should be starting to understand how the separate and the 3D path are different from one another on a fundamental level. Because these controls are embedded into the way that it works, rather than there being angles and things directed to the actual handles, is why these have a curve by default, whereas the separate is straight by default. But does that mean we can't get to the actual function curve handles from this view? Yeah, of course we can. For starters, we can still activate it through the set ease for multiple parameters. So if I were to punch in 50 and 50 for those, it will push it out, but nothing has changed up here. That's because remember, inside the parameters for the 3D path, the velocity, which represents the function curve, is kept as its own category, and it's the combination of the location and the velocity which creates the curve. To access its editor is this button here. Press on that, and now we see something that looks a lot more similar to what we saw within the separate functions. This is a single value which represents the X, Y, and Z combined, and this allows us to directly influence the velocity parameter. So the beginning of the combined movement will always be 0, and the end of the combined movement will always be 1. See how the value is grayed out? We can't change the height of this or the angle of it because the velocity is exclusively the easing controls. So now we can select everything and choose an easy ease of our choice, or mess with the handles individually as we have done before. The angles and the distance is all pretty similar. It represents it as a unit, but this button appears yet again, and this time when you click on it, you can see you can apply your decisions to the X, Y, and Z parameters individually. So if I wanted to create the same kind of bell shape, for example, like on our separate, the way to do that with a 3D path is to take advantage of control points. So hovering over the line again, I'll just keep adding them in until I get the nice subtle curve that I wanted. You can see what's happening over here in the function editor. Meanwhile, these circular keys have been inserted, which influence the shape, but not the speed. Going back into the velocity editor, they are not visible at all because control points have nothing to do with the speed. Also a good time to point out that the control points are yellow circles, whereas keyframes are the ones with the X in them that I was talking about before. The X representing locked time. The last cool thing about the spline editor, which I think I forgot to mention, is that when working visually, it allows you to pick up any keyframe as if it were a control point and then move it around and edit your shape without having to do anything numerically or even animate anything. You can just build a shape and then watch your thing travel across it. Now, if everything that I've been talking about hasn't been complicated and confusing enough, it goes even deeper still. Introducing the function window. Going to Windows, Function, we get this. And come on, wasn't the last thing we were looking at the function window? Well, no, not quite, because that would only edit a single function at a time. This is a dedicated place where you can see all of the functions taking place across your work. If I select our 3D path layer, look at all the stuff that appears. It's showing every single animated parameter at the same time. Control points, Motion keys, they're all there. We can even edit the values of our control points. Moving the X up and down is going to influence the way that the Y moves to the left and right of our animation as well. This is what the position separate looks like, showing the X and the Y functions both at the same time. We can turn them off and on. You can show and hide not just your individual layers, but also the type of parameter that they are. So position, rotation, scale, skew, and other. All the buttons in here are quite similar to what we're used to. But to quickly demonstrate, let's animate a scale because we're yet to do that. So I've made sure there's no other motion keys here at the moment, so we can be working clean. Over in layer properties, under scale, there is also two different types of function, separate and locked. This is a lot easier to understand than the difference between a separate and a 3D path, because a separate is simply being able to scale the X and Y values separately, make it tall, make it wide, whereas locked treats it as just bigger or smaller. Very, very simple. So changing it to locked, I'm going to press this once to turn it into a function. And over in the function window, selecting the layer again, we can see now there was a scale X and a scale Y functions before, but now there is just one. Drawing scale X, Y, scale. We'll make that visible and say we want it to start getting bigger from this point at, say, frame 20. If I add a keyframe at this point, it adds something to every single parameter that we currently have visible. So consider how this can be used to your advantage. It's a combination of both the edit multiple parameters and the individual function editors. If you have hundreds of layers going on, it can get quite hectic to manage. So now knowing about the 4 different ways to create functions with the easy ease, the set is to multiple parameters, the function editors, and the function window, as well as simply just working visually, you should be able to navigate your scene to be able to do what you need in a relatively stress-free way. So anyway, continuing on to try and make a scale, we're going to turn everything with scale on, everything with position off. That's quite handy having it on one button. It's only 2 at the moment, but consider if there were dozens and dozens of layers. So frame 20, we want to add a keyframe. Frame 40, another keyframe. And consider how the value of scale works compared to position. Remember that by default, scale is 1 because times itself, but pumping it up to 15 is just going to make it enormous. We only want it to, say, become 3 times its original value. If we use the scale controls up in advanced animation, we can also do it from there and see how the value is changing in the function window. Pretty cool. So we'll put it about there, zoom in and just give it a standard ease. So now, there we go. Okay, so we finally covered everything to do with function curves. Very, very complicated subject, but hopefully now it's not quite as daunting as it once was. Have some experiments and see what happens. Or even when you're just animating visually, keep the function window open to the side and see how the graphs tend to generate and crisscross over each other and all that stuff. But the next thing I want to show you is stop motion keyframes. This is a very simple feature that has huge amounts of benefit in improving your animation aesthetic. The idea, quite simply, creating 2 master keys here, pulling it across, motion happens. But if I select this first motion key here, and along the timeline controls, there's this one with the curvy line and this one with the straight line. Hit the straight line and all of the notches along the line have vanished. Over in the function window, you can see it is now straight and then jumps all the way up. And sure enough, still, bang, it snaps over to the other section. If we hit the curvy one again, it comes back and regenerates the movement. This has enormous amounts of use. Something suddenly moving from one place to another is very common and is particularly useful if you're combining hand-drawn elements with generated function movements like this. Say for example, you have a frame-by-frame body, but you're tracking a still head across. Trying to make the head stay accurate to the body without looking floaty and gross is really, really hard, especially if the body is animated on 2s. You're going to want to go through every second frame and track the head to the body, but it is still looking floaty because it's moving every frame. Now that you've got motion keys on every second frame, just select them all and press stop motion. Now it looks a lot better. A very, very handy button has been introduced to Harmony. It's very jarring when something is moving very smoothly against characters that are moving at a slower frame rate. It's good to keep things consistent where possible. If you select everything, there's a button along here which is this, an image of 2 frames called Create Keyframes On. And when you press it and hit OK, it will do this. It's placed down a motion key on every second frame and then broken the tween, turning it into stop motion frames. So you get this. You see that? It is a generated tween movement animating on 2s. You would have also noticed that inside of its control box, you can change all sorts of different stuff. If you want it to be on 2s or 3s or even more. Very, very useful feature. But there's something kind of similar to it as well. If we go back into the function editor for a single parameter, see how it is a standard single tween, there's this button here. This isn't a stop motion button, that's here. That will turn a function into a stop motion key, but this one's a little bit different. We can tell it how long we want it to go for. So this function is going between frames 10 and what is that, 37? So I'm gonna put in 15 and 25 and give it 3 steps. Apply. And there you go, you can see what's happened. In between frames 15 and 25, it has now given it a small portion of stop motionness. And you can still add more keyframes inside and even ease it. But the steps are not keyframes, they're not motion keys, they're not control points, they're not anything, they kind of just exist. And they only exist between that space, well, according to what you've placed in here. Now at last we know everything we need to know about parameters and function curves. But did you know that it is possible to share the functions between different parameters? Yes, this is why functions and parameters are considered two different things. It's also why when a function is created, that it has this name that is grayed out. You know, it's not just the number, it is called drawing position X and then the number value. That's because this is actually archived inside of the working folder. Somewhere in the background of the software, all of the functions that exist are kind of library and they are just pinned to different parameters. Remember what I was saying at the start about how every function is simply a number value and it only is given effect once it is applied to any given parameter. That should mean that we're able to unhook a function from one parameter and then give it to another. We've sort of simulated this by copying and pasting motion keys from one parameter to another, but what about actually sharing them? So two different parameters will always be perfect mirrors of one another. At the moment you can see between these two motion keys the compass moving from left to right. Down each parameter there is an icon that looks similar to these. It's representing the Bezier curves. Touching on these will do the same thing as touching on the drop-down menu over in the layer properties. Pressing the button opens up the editor, but the drop-down menu brings us to this list. So on position Y, which is currently blank, I'm going to go to the drop-down menu and go to Bezier, Drawing Position X. You recognize that is the same name as Drawing Position X here. So if I select this, motion keys have been added to the position Y parameter, and it will now be moving diagonally, as the same parameters are being animated from up to down to left to right. And if the motion keys are moved on one, it's moved on the other, because both parameters are simply linking to the exact same function information. Consider again that each number value means nothing until it is given to a parameter. So if these numbers were to put into a scale, what's going to happen? So on a locked scale sharing the X and Y, I'm going to go to it from down here, and once again, Bezier, Drawing Position X, Drawing Position X. It's listed here twice because it is being used twice. There we go. It's going from -13 to +7, which gets it pretty big and small, which it can be quite frustrating to use. That scale is so different to position using the field chart. So luckily enough, in layer properties, there is this checkbox here, Scale in Fields. Turn that on, and the number represented is now equal to the field chart. Does that make sense? So here's an object that has a field height of 1 on the field chart. And if it was pushed up to 12, it will now be the height of the screen. If you want to change something, selecting the motion keys and deleting them won't work because it's deleting the motion keys from the function itself, which will erase it from every parameter. So if we want to remove it from the scale parameter, we need to unhook it once more. If we go to the drop down again, we can choose local. That will unhook it from the current parameter. I'm going to do this to position Y as well. Making a function local actually performs another action as well. On another very happy compass, I'm going to go to position X, Bezier, Drawing Position X appears once more, and there again, performing the same left to right movement. I've given the main compass this small Y movement here. Goes up, just up and down in the middle. And I want to apply it to my happy compass as well. Going to position Y, however, if I go up to Bezier once more, compass and happy layers are there, but they both only show Drawing Position X. I can't get to the newly created Y movement. That's because this new one has not yet been made public by pressing the local command. To keep things clean, by default when you're creating new functions, it is kept private to the particular layer that you're working on. So if I were to go to position Z and Bezier, I can see other functions that are exclusive to this layer. To be able to share them across different parameters, I need to make the functions public. This can be done in one of two ways. The first way we've already seen, which is called local, that will disconnect it from the current parameter and just throw it up into space. That means anything can reconnect to it, and you will find it under the unconnected section. So the other way to share a function makes it public but still keeps it connected to the original. To do this, we right click on the parameter that we want and go to Share Functions. This has now made it public, and if I go to Position Y up here, I can find it under the Connected section, Compass, and now all of the functions from that layer are available for me to use here. Ta-da! I apologize if this is a bit of a confusing thing to get to grips with. It's quite a well-hidden feature, so I'd like to kind of reinstate it by going through each one of these options. This list archives and allows you to navigate all of the functions that are available in your document, as well as allows you to create new ones. Despite everything we've been doing so far and creating all of these different types of functions and using them in all sorts of different ways, would you believe that we've actually only been working with one type of function? All of them are under the category of a Bezier. Bezier functions are created by default whenever you hit this button. They're created by the default whenever you start moving a shape around. But there is a completely different type of function which you can use, and its only real difference is simply a matter of preference. You may never knew that this existed, and it may revolutionize your workflow. Let's take a look at one. So under position X for the compass, we are going to create a new function now. This will simply disconnect the original one and throw it under the local category in case we want to return to it later. But rather than creating a Bezier this time, we're going to deliberately create an ease. Just like that, you can see the motion keys are deleted, and it might sound a bit strange creating an ease. Hasn't this entire process so far been working with eases? No, that's why they're called functions and not eases, because this is an ease. Double click on position X now and it will bring up our ease editor. It looks a little bit different to the Bezier editor. We know how to work with it. It is quite similar, but let's see what is different. I'm going to throw in a keyframe towards the beginning and towards the end, and look at this. Rather than having handles that we pull out and manipulate, which is what Bezier handles are, we now have these instead. As I pull this motion key up, notice that the curve is automatically created. And rather than pulling out handles to influence how much it curves, an ease comes with these tilting wheels that will affect the curve in a different way. If I add a new one in the middle, notice that the handles are not working. That's because, like on the Bezier, it's only affecting the angle. We need to give it a range of influence as well. So if I were to punch in 2 and 2, we can see we get a small degree of influence either side, and we need to make it a straight rather than a corner in order to do both simultaneously, just like it does on the Bezier. When I'm creating a new ease, setting up that manually can be a bit tedious. So I like to box select everything, choose a standard easy ease, and then adjust it from there. Spend a bit of time with the ease functions over the Bezier functions. See what you think. There's not really any real benefit to them over the other. It simply is a matter of preference. Some people like drawing with the pencil, some like drawing with the brush. Think of these in a similar way. So now understanding that both Beziers and eases exist, we now understand what a couple of these other categories are here. Everything in this list with an arrow on it is just about navigating all of the available functions in different ways so we can find the one that we want. Remember, they have to be public in order to see functions that were created inside of a different layer. We know that connected ones are public functions that are being used elsewhere. Unconnected is public functions that are currently just floating in space. And all shows everything, shows all of the public functions. So of course, Bezier and ease categorize things by that. But there's two more, expression and velocibased, and velo-based, velocibased, velocibased. There's no option to create them up here. Expressions, they are a very deep piece. Very, very cool. Basically, they allow you to add JavaScript into your functions and do all sorts of crazy things. It's so deep that I'm going to save it for another time. Velocibased, however, allow us to share the velocity function of a 3D path. Let's check that out now. So I've gone back to our raw compass, keeping things nice and clean, now switched it over to a 3D path. animating a bit of movement around the screen like so. And I'm going to adjust its ease by opening the velocity and really kind of just give it something pretty extreme so we will not be mistaken as to what is happening. Okay, so it's snappy and all over the place. Lovely. Meanwhile, the rotation's been animated just sort of spin around like that. So say we want to tap into the same degree of well, we could just go to set ease on multiple parameters to do it. That'll work. But the values will be duplicates of one another. If it's shared across multiple layers, it needs to be copy pasted, and if it gets updated later, you need to, go back and manually do each one. So because 3D paths are as complicated as they are with its kind of 3-in-1 shebang, there's a little easing failsafe built in. Where on our angle Z, we can open that up, and because there is a 3D path inside of this layer, we now get a create velo-based option. Select that before you create your movement because this is of course a new type of function. Create keyframes, animate as you would anyway. And look at that. Notice that it has applied its speed of rotation to the same timing as the position. If we open up the editor for Angle Z, we can see with only 2 motion keys present, it has mimicked the same function curve as the 3D path. And say now we want this rotation to be mimicked across Happy Compass, even though this layer's position is set to separate, as long as we share the functions, I can now find that function under the Velo-Base section. Compass set angle 1. Remember to set your pivot points though. Whoop, that's better. One last thing before we wrap up on sharing functions is if you have all of this going on and you want to go back to just having a regular old shape, making it local and just throwing it out into space will do just that. Okay, so now I should understand pretty well everything about how Toon Boom works with parameters and functions. Well, let's have a bit of a look at what else this information can be used for. So this entire time we've been dealing with the parameters contained inside of a regular drawing layer. So I'd like to show you the difference with a peg real quick. At the top of the timeline where you can add new drawings, you can also add new pegs with this orange button here. It gets automatically inserted inside of the peg, and then we can start on using it. A peg is very similar to a drawing layer in nearly every way, except it does not contain any kind of drawing information at all. It is strictly designed for creating functions, animating with motion twins, etc. Grouping a whole bunch of different shapes and drawings into one master peg that can then animate groups of things around, say different sorts of facial elements that are all controlled by one head. Animating with pegs is a good failsafe because you can create as many layers as you like that all exist with their own set of drawings, and they are all controlled under one set of function curves. Working with a system of pegs inside pegs allows you even more flexibility. Here is an example of pegs inside pegs in use in something fairly simple. In this case, each individual peg is essentially playing the role of each independent parameter. Advantages of taking this route means you can switch off certain parts independently and even focus on animating them one at a time. And see how it all starts to become combined. Something else to point out in this particular example is that in the squash and stretch section of the pegs, it also has its own independent rotation. This is so that the direction of the circle itself can rotate to be facing along with its direction of movement. How the oval shape is rotated as such versus the internal rotation of the shape, which rotates thus, keeping with its squishiness. It also has a lot of reusability, as I can take new drawings, attach it to the peg system, and look at it all go. This is great for grouping, character rigs, and if you're from a Flash background, is the replacement for symbols. A lot of Toon Boom animators are already quite familiar with the peg, but there is something in regards to all of this we've been talking about that is different between animating on a drawing layer and animating on a peg, which you may not be aware of. And that is, by default, when you create them, drawing layers are always a separate on its position, whereas a peg is always a 3D path. Did you know that? Has it affected things and you never knew why? So basically this. Don't forget this. Take a screenshot of this. Separates create their functions in straight lines and are defaulted to a drawing layer. 3D paths create their functions in curves and are default to the peg. Commit this to memory and you'll be zooming all over the program. And I'd like to point out that under the general tab in preferences, there's this settings section here where all of the defaults can be changed. So you can make different things be in ease by default, and you can also switch over if drawings and pegs are 3D paths or separates, as well as a couple of other things. So if you find yourself comfortable with a different type of workflow, there is a way to make that your standard. So that's pretty much it on everything to do with parameters and functions. But to conclude, I want to show you a couple of examples using effects. They are completely different in what they do, because they're not just animating positions and sizes and all that kind of stuff. They do all sorts of stuff. Glows, transparencies, blurs, oh, what fun. But their functions work exactly the same way that we have become used to. Here's our original compass, all grouped up in a master peg, groups everything and all the movement together. With animation mode turned off, I can move the entire thing without changing any of the animation. I can put it wherever I want and it will work just fine. So I'm going to make it big, put it in the middle, and let's put just a transparency onto it. If you're using Harmony Essentials, Advanced, or any of the older versions of Toon Boom, the effects are found under the plus symbol and under Effects. If you're using Harmony Premium, however, or Animate Pro if you're lucky, and apply a transparency effect under our compass, jump on down through the hierarchy to the transparency, open up its parameters, and we see a transparency comprises of just one single parameter. Now, typically we can animate that with ease by popping in keyframe at the start and finish and pulling the slider to the maximum extremities. That's the quickest way to get the job done, but now we also know that upon creating a function, we can double tap on the parameter and get to it this way. And we can treat it the same as any other function we've done, including grabbing it all, hitting an easy ease, or grabbing the handles and pushing them beyond their extremes, so it will actually fade off and come back and off again. Because the curve goes past 100%, we can use eases instead of Beziers. We can use this multi-step thingy. We can share its function to other parameters. The possibilities have just grown immensely. So thank you for joining me on today's adventure. I do hope this has opened you up into some alternative workflows you may not have before considered, and even more so, be able to avoid some of those just tantalizing problems that you just couldn't think of a good solution to, or why it happened to behave this way. So good luck to you, all the best, have some fun, and I'll see you in the next one.